I live deep in the woods of the rural United States, far away from city lights and the hum of bustling traffic. Winters here are brutal but beautiful. Thick snow blankets the rolling hills, icicles dangle like chandeliers from tree branches, and the only sound is the distant call of an owl or the crunch of snow underfoot. It's the kind of isolation that makes you feel like you're in a world of your own. It was a week before Christmas, and the air smelled like pine and cold. I had this habit of taking late-night walks through the woods behind my cabin. It wasn't for exercise or adventure, it was more like a ritual, something that brought me peace. That night, the moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the forest, and the snow sparkled like powdered diamonds. I had my flashlight with me, though I barely needed it. The moonlight was so bright it illuminated everything, the skeletal trees, the frost-laden bushes, and the endless expanse of white that stretched out like an untouched canvas. I'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I started to notice something strange. There were tracks in the snow. Now, this wasn't unusual in itself. Deer, foxes, and the occasional bear made their way through these woods all the time. But these tracks were different. They were huge. Larger than any bear track I'd ever seen, and they weren't shaped like paws. They were more like feet. Human feet. Bare human feet. I stopped, my breath clouding in front of me as I stared at the prints. They were spaced far apart, as if whoever, or whatever, made them was taking enormous strides. The tracks veered off the main trail and disappeared into the deeper part of the woods. My gut told me to turn around, to head back to the safety of my cabin, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the tracks. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. It was unsettling. Normally, even at night, you'd hear the rustle of branches, the distant howling of coyotes, or the occasional crack of ice. But now, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of snow beneath my boots. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree, something tall and pale, standing motionless among the shadows. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was him. He stood at least 8 feet tall, his massive frame covered in thick, white fur that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. His face was partially obscured, but I could make out deep-set eyes that glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. His arms were long, almost unnaturally so, and his hands, if you could call them that, ended in thick, blunt fingers. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stared at me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. It was like being caught in a nightmare, where you're paralyzed and powerless to escape. And then he tilted his head, just slightly, as if he were studying me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, he let out a low, guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a moan, that reverberated through the trees. The sound was so deep I could feel it in my chest, like the rumble of distant thunder. That's when I finally snapped out of it. I took a step back, then another, and before I knew it, I was running, sprinting, through the snow, not caring about the direction, just needing to get away. The trees blurred past me, and my lungs burned from the cold air. I didn't stop until I saw the warm glow of my cabin's windows in the distance. When I finally made it inside, I locked the door and bolted it for good measure. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. My mind raced with questions. What had I just seen? Was it real? Or had the isolation finally gotten to me? I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the window, staring out into the woods, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But nothing came. The next morning, I mustered up the courage to go back to where I'd seen him. The tracks were still there, but they stopped abruptly in the middle of the clearing, as if he'd vanished into thin air. I haven't seen him since, but every now and then, when the snow falls thick and the forest grows quiet, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, watching. Waiting. The days following that encounter were a blur of unease and paranoia. Every night, I would double-check the locks on my doors and windows, something I had never felt the need to do before. Living in the woods had always felt safe, like the forest itself was a barrier from the dangers of the outside world. But now, it felt like the forest was hiding something, something that was watching me. A part of me considered packing up and leaving. But where would I go? This cabin, this life in the woods, was all I had. Besides, there was a stubborn part of me that refused to let fear drive me out of my home. So I stayed, but I was different now. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every rustle of branches outside, sent my heart racing. A week passed. It was Christmas Eve. The snowstorm had rolled in earlier that afternoon, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white and swallowing the world in silence. I stayed inside, keeping warm by the fire, sipping hot cocoa, and trying to push the memory of that night out of my mind. But as the evening wore on, that uneasy feeling crept back. It was subtle at first, like a shadow lurking at the edge of your vision. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But then, around midnight, I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. Tap. 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 It was faint but unmistakable. Something, or someone, was tapping on the window. My cabin only has a few small windows, most of them covered by thick curtains. The sound was coming from the one by the kitchen. Slowly, I got up from my chair, my legs shaking with every step. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. At first, I didn't see anything. The storm was raging, snow swirling in the wind, making it hard to see more than a few feet. But then, as a gust of wind cleared the air for a moment, I saw it. A face. It was him. He was crouched just outside the window, his massive frame partially obscured by the snow. His glowing eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I could see his breath fogging up the glass, his face inches from mine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the storm. What was he doing here? What did he want? The tapping started again, louder this time. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, just steady, like he was trying to get my attention. Against every instinct screaming at me to hide, I forced myself to look back. He was holding something. In his massive hand was a small bundle, wrapped in what looked like coarse cloth. He raised it slowly, pressing it against the glass, as if offering it to me. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing with questions. Was this some kind of gift? A warning? A trap? The tapping stopped. He placed the bundle gently on the windowsill, then straightened to his full height. For a moment, he just stood there, towering over the cabin, his glowing eyes fixed on me. And then, just as silently as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the storm, his massive form swallowed by the swirling snow. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where he had been. Eventually, curiosity, or maybe sheer adrenaline, got the better of me. I opened the door and stepped outside, the icy wind biting at my face. The bundle was still there, resting on the windowsill. I brought it inside, my hands trembling as I unwrapped it. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden figure. It was rough but beautiful, clearly handmade, depicting what looked like a bear standing upright. The detail was incredible, the fur, the claws, even the expression on the bear's face. What struck me most was that it wasn't just a random carving. The bear's face looked familiar. It looked like him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring at the figure, turning it over in my hands, trying to make sense of it all. Why had he left it? Was it a sign of peace? A reminder? Or something else entirely? I must have drifted off at some point, despite my nerves, because the next thing I knew, faint gray light was seeping through the curtains. It was Christmas morning. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of snow. The little carved figure sat on the coffee table, where I'd left it the night before, a silent reminder of everything that had happened. I spent the morning in a daze, my mind circling around the same questions over and over again. Who, or what, was he? Why had he come to my cabin? And why leave me this figure? It was a message, I was sure of it. But what kind of message? By midday, the sun was high, and the woods glistened with ice and snow. For the first time in a week, I felt a spark of courage. I decided to go back to where I'd seen him the first time, hoping to find something. Clues, answers, anything to make sense of it all. I bundled up in my thickest coat, boots, and gloves, grabbed my flashlight and a thermos of coffee, and headed out into the woods. The air was crisp, and the snow crunched loudly underfoot as I made my way toward the clearing where I had first seen him. The forest was quiet, but not in the eerie way it had been that night. It was peaceful now, the kind of quiet that feels alive with potential. When I reached the clearing, I stopped in my tracks. The snow was untouched, save for one set of footprints, his. They were fresh, leading from the edge of the woods to the center of the clearing, where they stopped abruptly. Just like before. But this time, there was something there. In the middle of the clearing, half buried in the snow, was another bundle. It was wrapped in the same coarse cloth as the first one. My heart pounded as I approached it, half expecting him to emerge from the trees at any moment. But the woods stayed silent. I knelt in the snow and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was another carving, this one larger and more detailed. It was of a man. He was wearing a long coat and boots, holding a small flashlight in one hand. It took me a moment to realize, it was me. The carving was unmistakably of me. The detail was astonishing, right down to the stitching on my coat and the shape of my boots. He had even carved the flashlight's beam, an almost lifelike swirl of wood extending outward. I stared at it, a strange mix of awe and unease washing over me. How could he have known this much about me? How long had he been watching me? I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to take the carving and leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something deeper, something primal, told me to stay. So I waited. I stood there in the clearing, the carving in my hands, and waited. Minutes turned into hours, and still, nothing happened. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow, and the cold began to seep through my layers. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it. A low, rumbling sound, like the distant growl of a large animal. It wasn't coming from the trees but from beneath me. The ground trembled slightly, just enough for me to feel it through my boots. I stepped back, my breath fogging in the frigid air, as a section of snow in the clearing began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the snow fell away, revealing a door. It was made of rough, weathered wood, with metal hinges that looked ancient. There was no handle, only a carved symbol in the center, a strange, swirling design that reminded me of the patterns in the carved figures. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. What was this? Why was it here? And what was waiting for me on the other side? The sight of the door rooted me in place. My thoughts were a chaotic storm. Was this some kind of trap? A test? Or had I stumbled upon something ancient and incomprehensible? The carving in my hands felt heavier, as if it were somehow connected to the mysterious entrance beneath the snow. I knelt down, brushing away the last of the snow from the door's surface. The carved symbol in the center was hypnotic, a swirling design that seemed to shift and ripple under the dimming light of the forest. Without thinking, I placed the carving of myself onto the symbol. The moment it touched the wood, a deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through my chest like a distant thunderclap. The door creaked, the sound ancient and heavy, as it slowly swung open on its own. What lay beneath was a staircase, descending into darkness. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with ice and frost. A faint, flickering light illuminated the first few steps, but the bottom of the staircase was shrouded in shadow. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to leave this strange discovery buried under the snow where it belonged. But something stronger, a pull, almost magnetic, urged me forward. I took a deep breath, gripped my flashlight tightly, and began to descend. The air grew colder with every step, and the sound of the forest above faded into an oppressive silence. My flashlight's beam danced over the walls, revealing strange markings etched into the stone. They looked like the swirling patterns on the carvings, but larger, more intricate, as if they were part of some forgotten language. The staircase seemed endless, but finally, I reached the bottom. The passage opened into a vast chamber, the walls lined with towering pillars of ice that glittered like crystal. In the center of the room was an altar, carved from the same stone as the staircase, and on it sat another carving. This one was different. It was enormous, easily 3 feet tall, and depicted a creature unmistakably similar to the one I had seen in the forest. The detail was breathtaking, from the texture of the fur to the faint glow in its eyes, captured perfectly in the carving's icy surface. Surrounding the base of the carving were dozens of smaller figures, arranged in a circle: bears, wolves, foxes, and other woodland creatures, all carved with the same meticulous care. I stepped closer, my breath misting in the frigid air, and noticed something else. The altar was inscribed with more of the swirling symbols, but these seemed to radiate outward from the base of the large figure, as if it were the center of everything. And then I felt it. A presence. It was the same feeling I'd had in the forest that night, the weight of being watched, of something enormous and ancient standing just beyond the edge of perception. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping the chamber, but I saw nothing. Nothing, until I looked up. High above, near the vaulted ceiling of the chamber, a pair of glowing eyes stared down at me. They were the same as before, burning softly with an otherworldly light. He was there, perched on one of the icy pillars, his massive form blending almost seamlessly with the frozen surroundings. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just watched, his gaze steady and unblinking. I don't know how long we stood like that, but eventually, he shifted, descending the pillar with a slow, deliberate grace. When he reached the floor, he towered over me, his presence both terrifying and strangely calming. He pointed one massive finger at the altar, then at me. I didn't understand at first, but as I looked back at the carving, something clicked. The smaller figures, the animals, weren't just decorations. They were representations of the forest itself, the life that thrived within it. And the large figure at the center? That was him. And now, he was asking me to take my place among them. The realization sent a chill through me, colder than the icy air of the chamber. Take my place. Among what? Among them? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The massive figure's glowing eyes bore into me, unyielding, as though waiting for an answer I didn't fully understand. I looked at the altar again. The smaller carvings of animals, arranged in a perfect circle, now seemed less like simple figures and more like representations. A bear, a fox, a wolf, and others, all creatures of the forest. They seemed connected, their positions deliberate, each facing inward toward the large carving at the center. And then there was the space. Near the base of the altar, there was a gap in the circle. A single spot, empty and waiting. My eyes darted to the small figure I had carried with me, the carving of myself. Was that my place? The creature moved closer, his footsteps barely making a sound despite his massive size. He knelt, his enormous form casting a long shadow over the altar. With one hand, he gestured to the gap in the circle. With the other, he pointed at the carving in my hand. The meaning was clear now. He wanted me to place it there. But why? My fingers tightened around the carving as doubt flooded my mind. Was this some kind of ritual? A binding contract? What would happen if I set the figure down? Was it a gesture of acceptance, or surrender? I don't understand, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the vast chamber. His head tilted slightly, as if contemplating my words. Then he extended his arm, slowly pointing to the swirling symbols etched into the altar. His massive finger traced one of the patterns, and as he did, the symbols began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with my own heartbeat. A low, resonant hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone and ice. I could feel it in my chest, in my very bones, as though the chamber itself was alive, responding to his touch. The glowing symbols weren't just carvings, they were a language. A story. Images flashed in my mind, vivid and impossible to ignore. I saw the forest as it once was, untouched by human hands, alive with a primal energy that connected every living thing. I saw the creatures of the woods, their lives intertwined, their existence tied to something ancient and powerful. And then I saw him. He was the guardian. The protector of this balance, this harmony. But he wasn't alone. Others like him had existed, each tied to a different place, a different wilderness. Over time, as the world changed, many of them faded, their strength diminished as their lands were overtaken, their connections severed. But this forest, this small, isolated pocket of the world, had remained intact. And now, it seemed, he was asking me to become part of it. I don't know how I knew this, I just felt it, like the knowledge had been placed directly into my mind. The carving wasn't just a symbol of me. It was a piece of me, a representation of my bond with this place. If I placed it on the altar, I would be accepting a role in the cycle, in the balance. I would be tied to this forest in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The creature watched silently, his glowing eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Was it hope? Expectation? Or something more profound? Finally, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. My hands shook as I reached out, placing the carving into the empty space on the altar. The moment it touched the stone, the entire chamber came alive. The symbols flared with brilliant light, casting the room in a golden glow. The carvings of the animals seemed to shift, their forms becoming more lifelike, as if they were breathing. The large figure at the center of the altar pulsed with energy, its glowing eyes mirroring those of the creature standing before me. And then I felt it. A surge of warmth, starting at my fingertips and spreading through my body. It wasn't painful, far from it. It was comforting, like the embrace of a long-lost friend. I felt connected to everything, the trees, the animals, the very earth beneath my feet. The creature stepped back, his massive form retreating into the shadows. For a moment, I thought he was leaving, but then I realized, he wasn't leaving. He was watching, waiting to see what I would become. And as the light of the altar began to fade, I understood. I wasn't just part of the forest now. I was its guardian. When the light faded, I stood in the chamber, a different person, or perhaps, something more than a person. The air felt heavier, like it was thick with life, with energy. My senses sharpened in ways I couldn't fully grasp. I could hear the faint creak of ice shifting deep in the pillars, feel the pulse of the forest above, even taste the cold metallic tang of the chamber's ancient stone. I looked down at the altar. The carving of myself now glowed faintly, a soft golden hue radiating from its surface. The other figures, the animals, seemed to have shifted their positions ever so slightly, as if acknowledging my presence among them. The creature, the one who had guided me here, stepped forward again. He was close enough now that I could see the intricate patterns on his fur, the deep intelligence in his glowing eyes. For the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt acceptance. He raised one massive hand, his fingers curling inward as if gesturing for me to follow. I nodded, almost instinctively, and together, we ascended the stairs, leaving the glowing chamber behind. When we emerged into the clearing, the storm had passed completely. The forest was quiet, blanketed in a soft layer of untouched snow. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden light that seemed to make the world shimmer. The creature turned to face me, his towering frame outlined against the brilliant backdrop. He extended his hand again, but this time, it wasn't a gesture of guidance. It was a farewell. "You're leaving," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. He didn't respond, at least not in words. But in my mind, I felt a wave of emotion, gratitude, reassurance, and something that felt like trust. He wasn't abandoning the forest. He was passing it on to me. And then he turned, his massive form disappearing into the trees with the same silent grace he had shown that first night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he had vanished, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over me. I wasn't just a visitor in the forest anymore. I was part of it. The days that followed were different. At first, I wasn't sure what had changed. Life in the cabin seemed the same, chopping wood, keeping the fire going, surviving the cold. But as I ventured into the woods, I began to notice things. The animals no longer shied away when I approached. Birds would perch nearby, their eyes meeting mine with an unsettling intelligence. A fox once crossed my path, pausing to look at me for what felt like an eternity before trotting off. Even the wind through the trees carried a new sound, like a voice whispering just out of reach. And then there were the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of the forest, but not as it was now. I saw it through different eyes, older, wilder. I saw the world before humans, when the forest stretched endlessly and the creatures within lived in perfect harmony. I also saw flashes of danger, logging machines, smoke, the slow creep of civilization encroaching on this sacred space. The dreams weren't just visions. They were warnings. One morning, I woke with a start, my chest tight and my heart racing. The dream had been more vivid than ever. I had seen men in orange vests, their trucks loaded with equipment, preparing to clear a section of the forest just miles from my cabin. It wasn't just a dream. It was a message. I grabbed my coat and headed out, my steps sure even though I had no map, no plan. I simply knew where to go. When I reached the site, I found them exactly as I had seen, 3 men, a bulldozer, and stacks of orange cones. They hadn't started yet, but they were preparing. "Hey!" I called out, my voice carrying through the crisp morning air. The men turned, startled to see someone out here. One of them, a burly guy with a clipboard, stepped forward. "This is private property," he said, frowning. "You can't be here." "This forest isn't just land," I replied, my voice steady. "It's alive. And it doesn't belong to you." The man looked at me like I was crazy. "Look, lady, or whatever you are, this is a job site. We've got permits. Move along before I call someone." I stepped closer, and as I did, something strange happened. The forest responded. The trees seemed to sway, though there was no wind. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that made the men shift uncomfortably. Birds began to call out in unison, their cries sharp and piercing. The burly man took a step back, his bravado faltering. "What the hell? You don't belong here," I said again, and this time, my voice carried a weight that wasn't mine alone. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of something ancient and powerful. The men exchanged nervous glances. Then, without another word, they got in their truck and left. As I stood there, watching the bulldozer rumble away, I felt a strange sense of peace. The forest was safe, at least for now. I knew it wouldn't always be this easy. The world outside was relentless, always pushing, always taking. But I also knew I wasn't alone. The forest had chosen me. And I would protect it. Forever.